We are live. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. This is going to be a live stream about pagan hearthkeeping. I have a special guest, Selina Rifkin. You may remember her from when I did an interview from her latest book. And I do have a link to her blog that is pinned at the top of our chat. So be sure to check that out, especially after this discussion. This is just going to be very relaxed and free flowing and everything else because we're going to be talking about pagan hearth and home and everything that could possibly be associated with that. Now, anyone who's familiar with my channel, you know I'm coming at it from the point of view of the world of witchcraft. So the way we interact with our homes and our energy, it's a lot more immediate. It's a lot more, this has to get sorted out right now, just because if the energy we're surrounding ourselves is not in a good condition, that's going to affect our spell work and our rituals and everything else. Selena, why don't you fill the audience in about what perspective you're coming at this discussion from?
I mostly study Greco-Roman. That's been kind of my ground for the last, probably 15 years, and it does go back into childhood. So I spent a lot of time, especially recently, studying the different deities, and so I definitely will be talking about Hestia today. And also, I want to bring in a little bit of what hearth and home, because that what that meant in the ancient world was really very different than what we have now. And so I want to get to that a little bit too.
You know what? I think that's actually a really good spot to dive in because this has been mentioned on my top channel broadly. I know you've touched on it lightly in some of your blog posts. And it's just our disconnect from our hearth and home, and also the various attitudes and influences that have made people. Uh, I'm hard. I hate to put it quite this harshly, but have a disdain for the home and for home life and the work that's associated with it. And I think it's been extraordinarily destructive to people. I think it has really cut them off from a source of joy,
Mhm.
believe it or not.
Yeah.
And I'm trying not to put on my tinfoil hat, but whenever something attacks the home and attacks people's basic oasis of well-being, I just get hyper suspicious about what are your motivations? Why would you want to do this? What nastiness do you have in store once this ultimately plays out? Just kind of dive in wherever you want to start with that, and we will just ramble until we feel like the point has been made on this issue.
Okay. Um, so I think because we're modern people, I think it's good to start rather than going right into the ancient ideas of hearth and home, is that well, no, technically it is, because for thousands and thousands of years, what that meant was that there were two people, basically. There was a partnership between men and women, and both people were equally productive. We were a um, we were a subsistence economy, if you will.
Mhm.
You had people who were out there farming in Neolithic societies, where the husband is out there doing the heavy labor of seeding the fields and making sure things are going properly on the outside, but he still had to bring things back into the home. And the woman, her role was to make sure that the food was ready for people to eat, because you just can't
Mhm.
eat grain solid. That's really, I mean, it did wear down their teeth as it was.
Yeah,
But
and
there
we're
was a
not
prep.
horses after all. I'm
We
sure
are
that's
not
not good for
horses.
digestion.
No, we are not horse. We are not ruminants. We're not horses. And yeah, so there was preparation involved. But I mean, even in hunter-gatherer societies, that was true. I mean, women were largely responsible for the things that allowed them to that were interruptible, because women
Mhm.
had children. And so if you had a job that involved taking care of children, it needed to be something that you didn't have to be completely and totally focused on. Hunting isn't like that.
No, no,
So
not even remotely. And
not even
another
remote.
thing Another thing to your point is that we also sometimes forget that the tools they were using for this work were extremely limited, if they had any really to speak of at all. And of course, that means you're going to have to invest so much more time in what you're doing. And even
Yes.
as early as recent as the Victorian era, even if you had a household where you could afford to have servants, it was not uncommon for the lady of the house to still have a pretty active role and taking care of a lot of day-to-day practical tasks. And
Yeah.
it was out of necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a super important point. And originally, and that kind of leads us because the Victorian era is right around that was the Industrial Revolution, and
Right.
that totally changed the effect of what the hearth and home was. It used to be this was a place where both partners were being productive together as a team. You know,
Mhm.
the guy would bring home the elk, and she would, she'd handle the hide and prepare them, smoke the meat and all that sort of thing. Because if you didn't smoke the meat, there wasn't going to be anything to eat during the winter. And
Right.
the same thing with the Neolithic when we started farming. It's like the men had to be out there doing the farming stuff, and they did still do some hunting stuff during that period, but then they still had to bring this stuff back, and the women were responsible for clothing the family. If you in chilled environments, you needed clothes. Although there's plenty of depictions of the Greeks being naked, so maybe that was a little more optional. Then during the winter, it did get cold, so it wasn't.
No,
It
I
isn't like
mean,
it's warm all the time. But,
seeing as how we just, at least in my area, came out of a pretty overbearing summer that lasted into the end of
mm,
October.
yeah, it did
Kind
here
of
too.
understand in an ancient society who had different notions of modesty about how there would be occasions when perhaps one dispensed with the clothing. And I don't think it was nearly as salacious as what some
No,
modern people like to
no.
believe that it was. I mean, they didn't have air conditioning. Not everyone had a clean pool that they could just dunk into. And,
Mhm.
at a certain point, one walked around as nature made them. I'll put it that
Yeah,
way.
absolutely. Oh yeah. I mean, there's plenty of depictions of that in the art and what have you. But then, once we hit the Industrial Revolution, especially weaving, because weaving was women's work like for millennia. And
Yeah,
again, you could stop it, and you could handle, could change the diaper or feed the baby or whatever you needed to do, or go tell the little older ones what to do. And that's very, very different from what happened during the Industrial Revolution, when all of that suddenly got taken out of the home, and the thing that made women productive and valued
mhm,
was removed. And so during the Victorian era, what sort of became the case was that women's job became making the home a safe and cozy environment for the guys who were going out and doing the work. But also, women did a lot of the volunteer work. They organized shit, they did
yeah,
stuff, they did all the things. So that they did, women did this whole thing of how they decline that. Um, women made sure that society was running. It was like a lot of the
yeah,
the so in some ways we can almost think of the hearth, and this I'll tie this back into Hestia, because Hestia, interestingly enough, she wasn't a deity that was worshipped personally. She was actually associated with the Greek state, and so that was the whole, that was what they would call the polis, the
mhm,
city, the group of human beings. And she was kind of like, she was associated with the group, and she wasn't,
mhm.
there aren't any stories about her, which is very interesting. Maybe there needs to be. Maybe I should write some, because that's one of the things I do. Um, but
Muse, hint, hint, nudge, nudge.
so yeah, so she's very foundational. That's the word I want, is
Mhm.
foundational to both the Greek polis, and she was also foundational for Rome. The Vestal Virgins, which the word Vesta actually isn't related to the word Hestia. It's not where it comes from. They're completely
Mhm,
etymologically different.
mhm.
Um, but um, but that was it's like if the Vestal virgins didn't approve of something in Rome, it won't happen. That was done.
Oh, I did
So
not realize they had that kind of power.
they had
So
a lot
this
of
is good.
yeah, they had a lot of power. So this was it was very the hearth, and it was like the central flame, not even so much even the cooking aspect of it, but the flame that was the center of the house, which is like that makes me think of Brigantia and her flame. So I think that eternal flame thing is probably that may be something that's very primal to us as humans.
No, that does make sense because that is absolutely core to both of these particular goddesses. And one thing I wonder is if the flame doesn't just represent, this is where we get warm, or, this is where the cooking can take place, or this is where things can be forged, or any of that. I wonder if it is actually pointing us to the actual human spirit, and if that's
Mm.
saying something about really about ourselves that is being communicated to us through these stories about these deities, or at least the positions they held in society. Because, as you mentioned, there's a little bit of a dearth of storytelling where Hestia is involved.
Yeah. Yeah, well, she wasn't a big, all of the other gods, they all, there was a lot of going out and doing things, big adventures. When they had the war with the giants, Hestia is not even mentioned, and the assumption is she was home minding the hearth. Um, she didn't go out and she didn't get involved in the fight. Everybody else did. So she was
Well,
somebody's got to keep the ground of being while everybody else is going out and doing the action. It's like it's like the center, not I wouldn't say necessarily the eye of the hurricane, but the center. Um, Jonathan Pajot actually uses he describes this as a wheel. So like you have the core center that is
mm-hmm.
that is solid, that's the thing that's holding in place, and then the spokes spin, and the further you out to the edge you get, the more pressure there is to fly out. So you want to stay, if you're going to move, you've got to stay within a certain distance of the center. And and every Greek polis had a place where they had, where, Hestia was very central to that. It's like they made very sure to maintain their center, and Rome did the same thing.
It's interesting what you said about the center, because a couple of things popped into my head about how, you're describing how essential that center is to the wheel, and it being a good metaphor for this goddess. And then I thought about, but you never actually notice the center, and
Mm.
you could
Mm.
not exist for
Yeah,
2 seconds without it, but you don't notice it. And I
yeah.
thought, okay, so perhaps that's why she's not as loud of a
Hmm.
presence as other deities are. And then I also thought, is that part of some of the resentment that got exaggerated and manipulated that
Mm.
caused women to divorce themselves from finding meaning and purpose in the
Mm.
home?
Yeah, that yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's Yeah, yeah, it was probably it's probably very exploitable. Um,
Hmm.
and certainly in the ancient, like for example, in ancient Athens, wives in particular were very out of the public sphere. Like as
Hmm.
a woman in Athens, and this is Athens in particular, so it was one small place. And certainly Roman women had plenty that they did out in public, and other
Hmm.
Greek polises had things that but Athens in particular, which is actually a lot of Athens, what we find from Athens is the basis of our Western culture.
Yeah.
Um, the women in that culture were you were either a female entertainer. Mm-hmm. That could have been anything from, think of it sort of like the Japanese, what do you call them?
Oh, the geishas.
The geisha. It's like a geisha. They
Hmm.
might be anything from sexual to they're singers or whatever they were
Hmm.
female entertainers. And so it was them, they could go out in public. They could go out and do whatever they wanted, but the wives were expected to stay home. And let me tell you, those houses did not have windows. So, you could go out in the courtyard, but they didn't have exterior
Hmm.
windows. That was the way they built houses. And so, yeah, so that would have been very confining.
Hmm.
And there was, as a species, women are just as smart as men. We have to be, or we
Hmm.
can't produce smart babies.
Yeah,
But, if
as
we,
many man has learned the hard way. He
yeah,
picked her because she was pretty, not because she was smart. And then you look at the kids, like, yeah,
yeah, there you
could have
go.
told you that was going to happen, Snuggy Bear. But please continue.
So that could have provided some pretty exploitable points. And, even not in the time period of, even maybe, it depends. I can't pretend to know what a woman of that time period would have thought. I can certainly speculate what I would feel like in that situation. um
Yeah, but it's hard to put ourselves in those shoes because that it's so alien to our life experiences. I mean, how do you even begin to imagine? And it's one thing if you've been raised your whole life and this is just what you expected, versus someone who was in a completely alien environment. If you were plopped down in there, then
mhm.
you would have completely different psychological reactions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm I'm going to be 60 next month, and even over the course of my life, I get that. So it's like, oh, what was that? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and one of the big challenges that I see ahead of us is just kind of detoxifying because right now it's
Mm.
still in a lot of people's minds, a lot of women's minds, the idea that the home should be prioritized or that they could even make that essentially their profession. I mean, that is just radioactive. People
Mhm.
have extraordinarily strong reactions to that. Now, the pendulum is starting to swing. It isn't always swinging very helpfully because I find a lot of the online content that is supposedly promoting housekeeping is very performative. Some of it is outright, this is icky, but fetishistic. They're feeding a certain
No, no,
fantasy in their
I
viewers'
exactly,
minds.
yeah, I know what you mean.
Some of
So,
these women are putting forth completely unrealistic expectations. A couple months ago, I did another stream with another pagan lady, and that we had just seen this video of this woman who claimed that she spent 5 hours a day every day in her kitchen. And we were just agog, saying, What in the name of all of the gods are you up to, woman? Are you milling your own flour? And so
she might be. Yeah.
I mean, who knows? But it was so unrealistic. That is so clear that it's not going to be the day in, day out uh, reality that anyone is going to actually live with. But I feel like because people are putting forth that image, and because you have on the opposite end of the spectrum of, oh, I must escape that, otherwise I will be unfulfilled as a human being. And I have not found a healthy way for us to like the middle is the reality. The middle is healthy. The middle is where we can be happy and we can reject those. It doesn't matter if other people are crazy. We can do something that's sane. And for whatever reason, it has been such a slog to get that message through.
I think too, any woman who has been raised, now you were actually raised a little more traditionally, I expect, than I was. My mother was classic feminist. She was a single mom, which was even unusual in the culture, where I was. She was.
Hmm.
I knew one other person who was being raised by a single mom when I was growing up. Everybody else was, mother, father, multiple siblings. I was an only
Hmm.
child too, so it was like multiple weird for me. But all of the things that we do in the hearth to take care of the home, we didn't get taught to do. You might have. I don't
Yeah.
know.
No, but it would take too long to explain why, because that goes into my relationship with my
Right.
mother, which was a train wreck from day one. I screamed every night for the first 2 years of my life, and she couldn't comfort me. So we did not begin well, and it never improved. So, I think she would have liked to have taught me, but she was also working full time for most of my life,
Okay.
and
So
she
same
wanted
then.
yeah, I mean, she wanted to be very involved and she was always meticulous. I mean, we never had cause to be embarrassed about the state that the house was in, but she always had to do it hyper efficiently. And I think that's another reason why she didn't necessarily insist upon getting me or my brother more
Right.
involved, is just because it has to get done or it won't get done. I don't have time to
Mhm.
teach these children.
Yeah. Yeah, and I certainly didn't get taught any of that. And the upshot of that is that it's not easy. And if
Yeah.
you didn't have someone who was coaching you in how to do this from a young age, so that it isn't, because when we decide we're going to do something, if we have to engage our frontal lobe in order to think about how we're going to do X, then
Hmm.
it's really exhausting to do X, because this burns a lot of
Hmm.
energy, burns more energy than
Yeah.
anything, any other organ in the body. Ideally, these things are repeated enough that it's like driving. We don't have to think about it. You know, how
Yeah.
often have you gotten in the car and drove somewhere and were like, wait a minute, how'd I get here?
Yeah, because everything just almost happened on autopilot. I mean, it's
Yeah.
kind of scary. Whenever that happens, like, okay, I'm going to pay much more attention on the drive home
Yeah, I mean,
because
ideally,
I
you're
need to
not
know what
doing
I'm
that in the
doing.
car, but I know that's something everybody can relate to. But
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to tell a little story. When I was a little girl, my mother and I went to visit my aunt, and my mother's idea of hot chocolate was always instant. That was what I had always had. And
Hmm.
my Aunt Augusta asked me if I wanted some hot chocolate, and I was like, "Well, yeah, who doesn't want hot chocolate?" So instead of pulling out a packet, she pulls out cocoa powder and milk and sugar, and she mixes it together on the stove, and she just did it like it was like nothing. And I was
Hmm.
so, and it's such a simple thing here. And I was just agog. I was like, wow. And it was like the best thing I'd ever tasted. But she didn't have to think about it because she was my mother's oldest sister. She had learned how to do this stuff. She was very good at all of the hearth keeping and homemaking stuff because her mother did teach her how to do it. By the time my
Hmm.
grandmother got to my mom, like your mom, she was done. It's like, nope, we're done. We're done here. My mother was the youngest, and she was the youngest of eight.
Oh,
And so,
wow. So
yeah,
she wasn't even really, she wasn't kind of nudged into that out of practicality. Whereas I'm sure her older siblings, like, you're
yes.
gonna help. You're
Yeah,
gonna help.
yeah,
You see your
exactly.
siblings?
Exactly.
I'm chasing
Yeah.
after them and they're screaming. You have to help.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my aunt was just, her parenting was just, she was right. She was just right there. It was not something she had to think about. Whereas, certainly for me, and I just noticed this even, I think this last year, it's like, why is this not easy for me? It doesn't seem like this should be that complicated. I mean, I have a male friend who he whips off porchetta and stuff like that. Just
Hmm.
like, and I'm like, it's like,
Well, I think that really testifies to how important our daily habits are in our daily
mm-hmm,
life, and that's
absolutely.
so much of what hearth keeping, regardless of
Yeah.
religion, is really about. And for us, I feel like we have that extra spiritual impetus because right now, for the most part, we don't have temples to go to, so we
Mm-hmm,
can't farm that out. And if our house is in completely disarray, well, that doesn't really feel like the right atmosphere with which to honor the gods or reach out to our ancestors or
mm-hmm,
do the other things that we've undertaken to do. And I feel like we have that additional pressure, and that's on top of like what you just described. So many of us were never really taught. It's
mm-hmm,
still hard. It's not a routine yet. And honestly, we don't get a whole lot of positive reinforcement from other women. And that's so deadly because women are the social enforcers of every society. We decide
mm-hmm.
what's okay, what's not okay, who's part of the
Yep.
club, who's not, even to the point where and this has happened so often when I'm having conversations with other women who do not think the way that I do, is that when I express a view that they find objectionable, they're trying to steer me into the acceptable opinion. And they try to
Mm.
do that multiple times before they realize that, no, I actually meant what I said, and I'm not susceptible to your influence. At which point they either have to submit, because I'm sorry, this is how women establish dominance.
No,
It's
I
so
no, I got it.
it's terrible, but this is what we do. They either have to submit or I have to be cast out. And those are the only two options. And I think that
Mhm,
that's something that men, particularly men who want to talk on this topic, even if they're very well intentioned, they do not understand that
mhm,
particular struggle because that's not how they establish
mhm.
hierarchy amongst
Right,
their own sex. But
right.
this is how it works for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and this is a complicated subject, and it's one that I've been rolling around in a bit lately, is that I'm not, and this is a bit off topic, I'm afraid, but
Oh,
I'm
that's okay.
oh, good.
We are freewheeling
Because I do
today.
want to, and I do, what I do want to get back to the hearth
Oh, yeah.
stuff, what what you do and what I do in terms of, creating that hearth space and what that feels
Hmm.
like. But my little off topic thing is that the way women relate to each other, I'm gonna throw this out there, is that all of the ethical treatises and our concepts of what is correct behavior, this was all formulated by men. And that's been good. It's been a very good thing because we want men to be less violent. This is good. Not
Yes,
completely
yes, we
non-violent because that's not good, but
they have to
under
be able
control.
to defend us if they need to.
Yes, exactly. Because, because we are physically very
Physically smaller.
vulnerable. We're
Yeah.
smaller, and when we're pregnant or we have kids, you better take care of us, dude. You're going to be worthy for that. I mean, it's important, species survival and all that.
Yeah.
Um, but that women have, I think our ethical structures is by necessity different because we solve our interpersonal problems differently.
Oh,
And
yeah. And we
and
have a different kind of interpersonal problems.
yes, yeah, yeah. We can't go have a fist fight. That's not going to work. That's how men solve their problems. No, but as you say, it's like you either agree or you're out. So how do we
Hmm.
mediate that? And there's got to be a way to do it. It's not going to be natural, but men not being violent is pretty unnatural too. So if they
Yeah.
can do it, we should be able to do something too. I still don't know what yet,
Well,
but
I mean, so far our solution seems to be that we have our own little groups, and
mm,
yeah, you have the women who generally get along with other women, and they're all doing their thing, and they're conforming to each other, and then you have all of the women who do not get along with other women, but get along with each other, and
mm-hmm.
that seems to be where we're mostly at. And
Yeah.
it's hard because that means at some point in every woman's life, she's going to feel like she's totally out of the cold, especially if she does not have a strong family structure. Now, that
Mm,
used to be a lot more rare generations ago, but as families have disintegrated, and that
mm,
that has been directly correlated with the disintegration of the value placed upon hearth and home, it is people get more atomized, and that is just
yeah.
incredibly destructive for women because our whole survival strategy is community based.
Yes, 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 yeah. All of that. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, we are so incredibly atomized. I mean, that was part of my family problem was that my mother grew up in Maine and she moved to Pennsylvania. And the first thing she did was start dating completely inappropriate men.
Of
So,
course she did. She was probably at just the age where, it would have been helpful to have a parent or a trusted aunt or uncle to say, perhaps not that one.
yeah,
Perhaps we could do
exactly.
better, dear. And
Yeah.
when you're on your own, you don't have anyone telling you those things. I mean, and even
Hmm.
though people don't listen, some of it does get through when they're getting good advice from someone they know cares about them, even if they don't immediately act on it.
Yep.
But if they're not there to give it, I mean, well, I guess we're living with the results of that right now.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting you bring that up about how your mom was in this alien environment. For my own mother, and the congregation she grew up in, there was a bit of a power tussle between essentially her family and other families in the congregation. They thought her family had entirely too much to do with the running of things and power and everything else. No one ever gave me meaningful details, so I have no way to adjudicate who was more right and the wrong. But she always felt like an outsider, and she was very shy. And being a Jehovah's Witness, you do have that obligation to be going door knocking and making a nuisance of yourself to your neighbors. So she was always being forced out of her comfort zone for the entirety of her life. Then she marries my father, who will be kind, eccentric. I love him dearly. I take after him. So I do say that with love. But, he was always kind of the odd man out. And if there was anyone who was saying, no, I don't think that's quite right, it was always going to be him. And that put him, at odds with the leadership for so many years. So even when she married, which should have been the formation of her community and more stability, she was still in that outsider position. And of
Hmm.
course, he was introverted. So she always thought he'll bring me out of my shell. And he's like, the shell's pretty comfy. We don't have to get put on our shoes. We could be having a nice evening at home, and won't that be great? And she just that was not the role she intended for him to fulfill. And so she never really got reintegrated with that. And to the best of my knowledge, that still hasn't happened for her. And I saw that show up in her behavior. She was always very anxious. She was always worried about what people thought because at the end of the day, she didn't believe anybody had her back. And and
Mm.
that's something that I don't think that men, because of their nature, are able really to appreciate about ours, about how they don't
Yeah.
realize about how we do need to cultivate our allies, especially, what
Mhm.
if he goes off to war and dies? Or what if I turn 40 and he leaves me for someone who's 22? What am I going to do then? I need to have my family. I need to have my girlfriends. I need to have my community. So I mean, it has been so destructive for women not to have that built-in community and to have lost the capacity to allow it to form organically.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not organic at all. At all. We have to, I mean, even the two of us, we had to
Yeah.
wait. I mean, it's been a struggle.
Yeah.
It's been a
I mean,
struggle just to connect.
yeah, just with, email and finding a place to actually chat and everything else. And look at us, we're having a video conference instead of
Right.
sitting in the living room having tea. I mean,
Right.
a person has to go so far out of their way. And one
Mhm.
thing observation you've made to me about just people in their general state at the moment is just you've used the word overwhelmed a lot. And when people are in overwhelmed, they're not in any kind of emotional condition to form new
Mhm.
bonds with people. And that's the very thing that would actually help us.
It is. That's really hard. And the hearth, I mean, the activities of the home originally, like in the Mesolithic, when we were hunter gatherers,
Mhm.
we were, women would be outside scraping hides all together. And then you'd get chat and the kids would be all running
Mhm.
around with each other. That's what we, as pagans, we often think about how nice it would be to live in a tribal society. We're not wrong. It's
Yeah.
just
Uh,
that most of those tribal societies were actually kin groups. People were related to each other in some form or another. And,
Mental
so
note to
it,
anyone watching, marry within the tribe. We need to start doing that.
so yeah, I mean so there we had that natural circle, but even in the Neolithic when we started farming, there were still villages, and
Mhm.
women could do things. They could say, okay, we'll do the weaving over here together today, or whatever it was, or they get together. I mean, shoot, the Amish still do this, where they
Oh,
get
yeah.
together, and you'll have corn shucking, and I've been to those because my babysitter was Mennonite. So when I was a kid, I was at corn shuckings. They was church twice a week, so all of the women were getting together. I
Mhm.
don't recall ever being at a quilting bee, but we did corn shucking, and there was, everyone was sitting around shelling beans or whatever. It was a deliberate case of people getting together, and that was part of the function of, you know elements in a very primal way. That's one of the functions of
Mhm.
religion, is to bring us together as a group. It makes us more groupish, in the words of Jonathan
Oh,
Haidt.
yeah.
So that's one of the things that increased our survival, and we sacralized things that were difficult, like going off to war, or
Yeah.
lighting the hearth, or minding
Yeah.
tending the hearth, and we made those things sacred. And it wasn't just like one person, because we're so isolated. It's just, it's like, okay, I'm going to do a hearth thing. Well, I'm doing it all by myself. It's
Mhm.
harder than if,
Yeah.
there was a point when I actually would have a friend come over and we would cook a whole bunch of stuff. It was kind of
Mhm.
fun. I haven't been able to arrange
Yeah.
that since then, but it was a cool thing to do. So,
Yeah, I
but
love that you bring this up because we're so on our own, and when it comes down to I want to do something with the hearth or I want to celebrate this holiday, you're probably writing your own ritual, and everyone who says, oh, if you don't write your own ritual and make it authentically yours, you're not doing it wrong. Uh, Stop it. Stop being
Mhm.
the asshole to make people feel inadequate. Not everyone is a writer, and there are very gifted people who provided very helpful templates to help people
Mhm.
who are on their own to at least get their feet wet. And that is so valuable because if we were, living in our little pagan tribe, we would probably have someone who had more so the responsibility for leading rituals, and they would take care of most of those arrangements. You would have other people who would be much more in charge of bringing the food. You would have other people who would probably be checking out, okay, is this date a good time for everyone? Have we gathered everyone together? Do we have something to keep the very young children distracted so that we can get something done? You would have people who would be able to delegate and spread out the work. When you're having to do all of that by yourself, I mean, is it any wonder that we encounter pagans who say, I don't really practice. I really believe, and this is important to me, but I don't practice. And I'm thinking, I think it's because you're by yourself. I really do.
Absolutely.
It takes an exceptional person to be able to do all of that, and that's something that I wish that my witchcraft community would really take more of a lead in of make it easier for people. Give them something to where they at least did not have to do one aspect of the thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, and I think you mentioned that you have, I think it also helps to have, things pre-set up. Like, didn't you tell me
Yeah.
you have an altar in your kitchen of some kind? Do you have something in your kitchen? Did you tell me that? I may be daydreaming.
No, no, I have my altar right here behind me.
Okay.
It's in my living room.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, it's set up all the time. It's already ready to go.
Yeah. So yeah, having an altar that's ready to go is very helpful. Um, One of the things I used to do is I started, and this was when I was raising my stepdaughter, who was a huge challenge. The best you could say about that was it was character building.
We'll just pour the whiskey right now.
Yes,
That's
yes,
what we'll do.
yes, yeah. And I actually had to be careful about avoiding that because it was like, oh, that was just a little too tempting under the circumstances. But
Yeah, I
I
bet.
did, I would keep a bowl of sage in the kitchen. I had a spot where I'd put it, and I keep that bowl of sage in there. And in the morning, after everyone left, I would light it because I had gas stoves. I'd light the sage on the stove,
Hmm.
specifically on the stove, because that was, there was a sacralization of that. And then I'd walk around and smudge the house quick, clear everything out, and and then dedicate whatever I was doing in my day to whatever deity seemed appropriate for that. And that was, that was helpful. It was very helpful,
Hmm.
and so yeah, we've been so
Yeah,
busy.
I really think it's medicine. And I
Mhm.
honestly think that having a bit of a return to the hearth, however gradual that it has to be, I think that would actually be very healing. Because you mentioned early on in the conversation that it used to be that women's work and their value and their productivity was very tied with the hearth, the home, and they derived respect from that essentially. And when that was taken
Yeah.
away, then also our respect, I think, also seemed to diminish. And that's something I'd like to touch on because I'm seeing a huge increase of that in the modern day. Now, part of it is because there are women who've gone out of their minds. They are man haters and they are very, very cruel. And I'm not going to deny the reality of that. And part of the reaction that we're seeing from men has to come from how hurt they are, from the constant rejection of being deemed guilty of being something awful before they've so much as said hello. I cannot imagine the torment, especially for them, because big emotions like that are not really what men do. So this is, I am sure, a particularly challenging time for them. But in addition to all of that, I'm seeing a lot of men who are saying, "Oh, well, she can't do this, she can't do that, so I don't have to respect her." And then even the women who do have these more domestic skills and are really excelling at them, they just don't seem to treat her with the regard that I saw my great grandfather treat my great grandmother.
Mhm.
The men and my family in general. I mean, even though I was raised, which would have been considered a patriarchal society. I had no doubt in my mind that my father infinitely valued my mother, had every respect for everything she ever did. I mean, there was never a doubt in my mind about that. Not him, not my grandfather, not anyone going back. It was just there was genuine appreciation for that work and what it accomplished and what it meant. But right now, what I'm seeing, including amongst some religious men, is that they're not having that respect. Like, you go do those things because that's all you're fit for. They
Mhm.
aren't valuing the product of that home.
Right.
They are
Yeah.
not valuing the excellence of the cooking. They're not valuing anything. And so, there are women who are like, "Oh, you see, the feminists were right all along. We
Hmm.
don't get respect if we do these things. We better keep on doing all this work that
Yeah.
makes us miserable. But at least we're not getting disrespected all the time."
Yeah, yeah. I mean, positive feedback matters.
Yeah.
There's nothing trivial about that. There's nothing trivial about, saying thank you
Hmm.
for the day-to-day work. And it's like it's kind of mindless. And um, you know, God's bless my husband. He will eat anything I put in front of him.
Oh,
And
good man.
oh,
Good man.
yes, he's wonderful. I mean, and we joke about it because it's not that I haven't ruined a meal or three in my day. And I'm still quite capable of it. Thank you very much. I do my best, but untrained, feral. So,
And
um,
sometimes the gremlins will have their way with things.
yeah, there's that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. But he also, it's like, bless him, he'll notice. It's like, oh, you cleaned the table up, honey. Thank you. And it is, it's all his stuff. But I
Hmm.
cleaned it up, but he's saying thank you for doing that. Or even if I go and help him with his shop in some way, he's like, oh, really, he thanks me. He thanks me.
Hmm.
It's really
Hmm.
awesome. But this is,
Yeah.
this is what I think a good man does. And this is one of the
Yeah.
ways you can tell if you've got a good one. It's
Hmm.
like they say thank you. They appreciate you for what you're doing, not in a gooey way. Well, it's
Yeah.
okay if he's good. We've been married for 20 years. Gooey is actually good at 20 years. But but it's yeah, yeah, I mean that's important. So if there's any
Yeah.
gentleman watching this, it's yeah, that really matters. Say thank you. Because all
A
and
little praise goes a really long way.
it really does. It really does. I don't need to be thanked all the time because then it doesn't seem genuine. But the fact that he
Yeah.
noticed that, and it was just yesterday. So, it's like,
Nothing
oh,
feels better. But,
mhm,
when a husband actually notices something, especially if you weren't expecting him to, that
mhm,
just feels really good. And
it does.
speaking of thank you to Elizabeth Russell. She is with us in the comments saying, great show.
Yeah,
Mwah, much love.
yeah.
And don't hesitate to put in your 2 cents with all of this because this is our means of having our little sewing circle where we're all talking about these things.
This is
So
what we got now.
please, if you're in the yeah, this is what we have. If you want to bring your sewing along with you, I mean that's fine. You can do that while we talk. But definitely never hesitate about participating because this is really our only means to have real time exchanges anymore.
Yeah.
Let's see. Where do we want to jump to next? I would like to talk a little bit about your impressions, your experiences, just a little bit more about Hestia, because lately I've been hearing a lot of people mention her name, and that always tells me she's calling up the troops. If people are,
Mm.
are thinking about her, she's calling up the troops.
Um, so I did. Um, so one of the questions that I had when we were chatting earlier,
Mhm.
before this episode, was I was wondering why she was a virgin because Hestia
Mhm.
she is very specifically virgin. She was
Yeah.
courted. She was courted by both Hermes and Apollo. Thought she was pretty nifty, and she was like, "Nope, I don't wanna. I just want to focus on what I'm doing." And I don't have a really clear reason as to why that is, but I think it has something to do with that very linear focus and maybe like I hadn't really been thinking about the hub of the wheel when
Mhm.
we were talking about this online. Um, and I think that it really is very much about almost like, planting your flag and saying, this is
Mhm.
where I'm going to be, and just holding that ground in a very, I don't want to say a masculine way because it can't be a masculine way. So maybe this is
Mhm.
something that I just want to roll around in a little bit more.
Mhm.
Um, it's
Would
very
rooted be perhaps a better word?
rooted. Yes, rooted would be a very good word. I like that word a lot. Yeah,
I was
almost.
thinking of that because, the earth element is very feminine and, everything she does is
Yes,
very
yes, yes,
feminine. And
yes.
of course, there's a lot of stability with that root system.
Yeah, and it's like, and you have to have something solidly planted in the ground. Like if you're going to have a fire, if you're going to contain it, if it's not going to be a wildfire, it's got to be contained, and that's a very
Mhm.
focused thing. Um, it's like you've created a barrier and a fire. I mean, just to get into the Smith thing a little bit, your fire cannot get hot unless it's contained.
Yeah.
So, I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about Bridget because I'm less familiar with Bridget, and it sounds like we might be, because you were talking about her with the Smith work, and
Oh, yeah. That's one of the things that she was known for. And it wasn't just the forging of weapons, although that certainly was, which obviously puts her in service of every warrior that ever was. But it was also farm implements, making sure that people had the tools required in order to make a go of it agriculturally. And it was also things like jewel crafting, which we have pretty things because the first thing
Mm.
humans do after we are at survival level is like, well, let's make it pretty. Every single culture ever. I mean, the moment like, okay, we've got a system, we're all living, nobody's dying, this is very good, we've got a rhythm. Now, how can we make it pretty? And it shows in architecture and clothes and jewelry and anything that they are
Mm,
able to wield. And that's one of the reasons why she's so tied with creativity. And she has three different forms of fire. It's this fire of the forge, it's the fire of inspiration, and the forge and the hearth are really tied in together. And it's also the fire of healing. And as a
mm,
counterbalance to that, she also has a very strong connection with the holy and the healing wells. So she has both of these elements that are both extraordinarily dynamic, that are the natural counterbalance of each other, and that it's all about having this very nurturing and very creative, and having the energy to bring something into a being. And so when I think of Bridget, I know a lot of practitioners they think of her when a mulk comes around, and
mm,
that's pretty much as far as it goes. And if that's your relationship with her, I'm not shading on it. I'm just saying is that it's limiting. Whereas with people who get to know her a little bit better, they see how she just wants to touch every aspect of life. And
mm,
that's very much
mm,
the instinct
mm,
of the homemaker, because she
mm,
is touching every aspect of life, from the cleanliness of the house to whether or not you have clean clothes to wear, to if there is food, to if you are going to be taken care of when you're sick, to where if you're making sure the your man, he's got everything he needs to go off to work. Are the children being properly educated? Who's looking after your aged parents? Has the garden been tended? All of these various things, she's all tied in with all of that. And the more you look at her, the more complicated she really gets. And just in case someone calls me out in the comment, yes, I know that technically in some stories there was three sisters who were Bridget and this and that. The more you look into the identities of Celtic deities, especially if they're coming to you in threes, the more complicated it becomes. And there's serious theological questions about, is this a singular entity that just is sometimes perceived at three parts, or is it three different ones, and all this and that? Draw your own conclusions. I am not going to dictate that. And every time I think about these identity issues with the Celts, I get dizzy. My head hurts. It's aggravating. And what I come back to is like, I don't think that the literal answer to this is really what is going to be of spiritual significance. So I treat her essentially as one being. If she's more than one being, she has not complained to me. But that's also another aspect of her. She's very loving, very nurturing. She's when I've worked with her, it's always felt like this focus of, are you doing your best? And
mm,
that has to do with whether I was in my early days developing as a witch, or if I've been turning more attention to the household, or if I'm just working on personal healing work, which right now I think everyone needs to be working on healing work. It's been a rough few years. But whatever it is, her, it's just, are you doing the best that you can? The best is the most you can do in that moment. And some days your best is going to kind of suck, but it was the best you had in that moment. So
yeah.
keep moving forward. And I find her a very powerful motivator, and that makes me actually think about some of those cleaning channels that you see on YouTube. Like, I want to provide you motivation so you'll get up and you'll clean your house and you'll do all these things. That's kind of what this goddess does. And you
Mm.
don't have to have a YouTube video for her. Just if you invite her essence into your home, I mean, there's something about you want to start bustling around like a bee, and you're getting into everything, and everything's starting to get taken care of. So that was my rambling initial answer. So where do you want to take it from there? Because
Um, I liked the whole thing about make it pretty because for me that ties the home into something that I think is very spiritual, that is uniquely human, which is creating beauty.
yeah.
And this is it's this is to create art, because she really is like, especially with the the poetry and that sort of thing, that
Mhm.
was that was in both Celtic and most ancient cultures. Some form of poetry or oral telling was that was primal. It wasn't just,
Mhm.
it was how a culture was communicated, but it was also to do it well, the better, the more beautiful you make it, the more it pulls you in and the more meaning it's going to have.
Hmm.
And so I like the idea of tying beauty to the hearth because we want, you've been talking about it, if your home is chaos, then it
Hmm.
doesn't, but if you make it beautiful, then your heart is going to be a little bit more open anyway. You're
Oh,
gonna you're gonna feel better. And there's actually some psychological studies about how we track things visually, and if there's too much chaos in an environment, we have to stop on everything we see. So if you clean it up and you create an empty space, it's like calming for your mind.
hmm.
But then if you create something beautiful, then you stop and you want to contemplate it. So to, to make beautiful food or to make food that, that tastes wonderful. It's like, oh, then we're pulled out of ourselves, and I think there's a relaxation that happens in the presence of beauty. And that, to, and even in weaving, women certainly took pride in their work with that.
Oh, yeah.
There's that story of Arachne, and that she was, she created things that were so beautiful. Now, what happened afterwards, we're not going to go into that. Um,
Yeah, we'll put that to the side for the moment.
let's just put that to the side. But that, yeah, to create a beautiful environment, that is, I think that's part of hearthkeeping, is to create a
Mhm.
beautiful environment. And, and
Well, and
sometimes
think
that
about.
beauty, yeah, yeah, so and that beauty might be visual, but ideally it's also tactile and
Mhm.
oral, and maybe even auditory, depending on I live with a musician, so there's lots of music in my house all the time.
And that does make it beautiful. And I think Elizabeth Russell's on board with us. What we're saying is really resonating with her. And what I was thinking about is just, let's consider what it means when someone is presented with beauty, especially if they know that it was made just for them. Like, you invite
Mm-hmm.
someone over for dinner and you take
Yeah.
them into the dining room and they see a beautifully laid table. And when I say beautiful, I'm not talking about elaborate or super expensive
Right.
china. I'm talking about something that is well arranged and welcoming, and
Mm-hmm.
they see and they know that you could have just said, come to the kitchen, here's your plate, we'll fork it out of the dishes on
Mm-hmm.
the stove and everything else, and you could still sit down and have a perfectly fine time. But the fact that you went to that extra effort, that's telling them that you think that they're worth it. And I think that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
messages
Yeah.
really been missing from the home. It's been this, that you are actually worth this effort, because we've been told you're not. And women have been encouraged to view their families, and even those who live on their own, as well. It's not worth doing for just one person. Well, it's not worth
Mm-hmm.
doing to my husband. He was insensitive today. It's not worth doing to my children because they're ragamuffins and they broke my lamp. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. So you have that build up over the course of a lifetime, and suddenly people aren't interested in beauty, or they think, well, that's just for women who have nothing better to do with their time. I am an important person. I do other things. I can't worry about whether or not it's pretty or if it's done at all.
Mm-hmm.
And you just see how we've been pushed into this naturally self-destructive cycle with that. But
Mm-hmm.
I am glad when I see people who are starting to say, I did this because it was pretty, or I embroidered this altar cloth, and I really wanted it to go with the seasons, or I did this, I did that because it was pretty. I feel like this is a very healthy, positive sign that we can start getting things moved in the right direction. And we had a Calliope. She's gone now, at 90 miles an hour. Temporary cat content. Blinked and
Yeah.
you would have missed it. No, I do think that beauty is a lot more important than what we previously thought it was. Because I remember growing up, there was a lot of emphasis about how superficial it was, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I always kind of rebelled about that. I'm like, yeah, it's so superficial, and that's why we have ugly buildings that I can't stand the sight of. And because when you see some of these thrown together shacks, and they wear out because no one really maintained. Because why would they? It wasn't worth it. It wasn't pretty. It didn't mean anything. And
Yeah.
the wrecking ball comes, and who cares? I mean, really,
Mhm.
who cares? When
Yeah.
if they had built things properly to begin with, would had some aesthetics in mind, then it would have been much more worthwhile to, well, let's update this, let's take care of it. And if it was brought down, then that would have been absolutely the last resort, and we would have been, boo-hooing over that.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're having that same experience with our homes. People, they didn't think it was worth to make it, and so they
Mm.
didn't. And so when it falls apart, oh, who cares? And I think that's why not only is it easier for a lot of people to divorce, there's a lot of them who are treating it like it's nothing.
Mm.
When
Mhm.
that's not nothing, that is a big something. I admire you coping, but this also feels like evasion.
Mm. Yeah. 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 I think that's, yeah, that's an interesting something to dig into. It's yeah. Yeah. The attention. It denotes a lack of attention. And it
Hmm.
can denote not just a lack of attention to, it's to everything. If you're not taking care of your environment, and your relationships are part of your environment, and your environment are part of your relationships,
Hmm.
it's, and
It's
maybe
an
that's,
investment.
yeah, and maybe that's really what the hearth is that it is an investment in our environment and our relationships.
Yeah, and I find it so sad that we've been stuck in this to where we haven't yet culturally fully come to that realization, because I think it really enhances the loneliness, and
Mm.
I think it. Oh, I lost my thought, and it was such a good thought. Damn it! I hate it when that happens. Uh, but it's such a sign of cultural sickness, and I think it's one of the tools that's used to bring men and women further and further apart. And I definitely think this is affecting people's spirituality, and
Mm.
and I think we've really got to look at that from the pagan perspective, because everyone knows what the Abrahamic perspective is, and it is, while there are some things in common with us, they are very different, and it doesn't always translate very well. And
Mm.
we have to start being brave and having these conversations amongst ourselves.
Mhm.
But when we have that spiritual breakdown between men and women, even within the pagan community, we are having an energy problem. And because I'm a witch, I can speak to this a little bit more, because everything is on these polar opposites. You see this in the Hermetic principles as well. And the masculine and feminine are one of those principles. They are energies that are operating on the same plane, but they are at opposite sides of it. And depending upon your biology, you're going to be much more embodying the masculine or much more embodying the feminine. But it takes the combination and union of the two to have a complete circuit. And when you don't have that complete circuit, everything goes higgledy piggledy. And I'm not saying that as someone who's attracted to their own sex that they suddenly have to change their mind. That's not what I'm saying. You will still be in partnership and community with men in your family, with men that you work with your friends. So it's not like that circuit is going to go uncompleted just because it's not having the sexual fulfillment of that completed circuit. But it's when we are constantly at odds, and if you don't have that, you don't have homes, you don't have civilization, and who does that benefit? And that's
Mm.
where I think people really stop their brains from going. Think about all of these things I've been told to pursue that made me unhappy, that ruined my relationships, that perhaps caused the clock to run out on me being able to have children, and I
Mm.
don't have a cozy home to go to, so I don't have an oasis from the crazy. Who has that benefited? Because it didn't benefit me. It didn't
Mm.
benefit anyone in my past. So who's collecting the benefits of that? And well, of course, it's tyrannical people who are saying, I have this wonderful government program that's going to replace your family, or I have this wonderful career for you, so you can work like a dog and I can fire you whenever I want, and you are totally expendable, but I want you to work as though you're not. That's what we'll give you. I mean, it is such an obvious poison pill when you just carry it through to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating. And I enjoy seeing it, this is something that shows up online. There's a few women out there. When I was growing up, I always wanted to be, I loved the Little House on the Prairie books. I don't know which of your listeners have read those, but they were
Well,
very
I've
popular.
read them, so.
Okay, excellent. So it was, and I loved all of the descriptions of what the prairie women did to
Mhm.
manage their household. That felt very appealing to me. I grew up in a freaking apartment. There was no way I was doing any of those things. I was like, if I could plant a few plants in my backyard and not get them mowed, which didn't happen, um, there was no possibility of me doing any of those things. And so, but there is, there are women who are like, you know what? I'm going to get my man. We're going to go farm, and they're
Hmm.
doing it. And the guys out there doing the permaculture and the regenerative farming thing, and you go in the house, and the wife is like, okay, we're gonna can the vegetables, and we're gonna raise the kids, um and I look at that and go, oh.
Yeah.
you
It's a
know
much happier equilibrium. I mean, they always
yeah,
seem like they're
but
much
they
more
look happy.
united.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they look happy, they look like an actual team. And that's, you know is it, how much of a team is it when you both have two separate jobs and you're off doing your thing? It's like, you know, that sense of, you know, the the hearth is, I think it's very tied up in unity, in that
Hmm.
team feeling between men and women.
Yeah.
It's
Of
because it isn't,
good times
I
and
don't
bad.
think it's I don't think it's enough to just, like a Victorian woman, to create the comfy space for the husband,
Hmm.
the respite. And it wasn't nothing. It certainly wasn't
Hmm.
nothing, but I don't think it was nearly as satisfying as having the actual economy of the home depend on what you were doing, not just bringing
Yeah.
in money, because it brought, your attention was in the home. It was in the family unit. And as human beings, we do better when we're with each other.
Yeah.
We're not, we can't, if we had evolved to be isolated, then we never would have had tribes. We're
No,
not.
I mean, we'd probably be like cats. We come together for mating
Yeah,
season, then we go off and raise the cubs, and
right,
so the cycle goes on. I mean, that's how it would
right.
have eventually worked out.
Yeah. And we would never have been as smart as we are, because we get
No.
smarter by interacting with each other. So this is like, this we're a little broken. We're kind of broken
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, we are. And I think it's important that we're honest about that because I think that's reasonable expectation saying, okay, perfection is out the window. I mean, perfection is always out the window because that's not really something that exists. And I think
Right.
that's one of the lessons we can take from our mythology. If things are not peachy keen perfect for the gods, why should we expect that or strive for it here on earth as
Fair.
humans? I think that's a good reality check for it. But it also, I think it helps people realize that it's okay to be a beginner. It's okay to
Hmm.
struggle your way through. And also, more importantly than else, it's perfectly okay not to go on this journey by yourself. I mean, if you want to reinvigorate the household, you might want to kind of clue your husband in about what you're doing, what's motivating you, and
Yeah.
why you feel like this would be important, and how
Yeah.
you want to be more in sync as a couple. It's like, okay, it really is just you and me against the
Yeah.
world. And that's really scary. So I want to shore up the bonds. And if you have to tell them this is a crazy thing about girl brain, then, okay, he may not understand it or get it, but he'll
Mm.
give him an explanation, which is all he
Right.
really needs. And
Yeah.
he'll cooperate on that basis because it keeps you quiet. And he's
Yeah.
not going to have to listen to the nagging of not cooperating.
Hmm.
And also, I think with the kids, I think people are so afraid of repeating the mistakes of their own upbringing that they have become afraid to raise their children. And I'm looking at how some of these kids behave. And I'm just pleased for the love of all the gods. You don't
Hmm.
have to beat them, but you do need to discipline them, and you need
Yeah.
to teach them. I mean, and especially even if your homemaking is coming very new to you, if you teach them as you go along yourself, then that means they're going to be growing up in an environment where this is normal. If they're learning that you make the bed when you're 5, it's not going to be a struggle for them to do it when they're 35.
Exactly. Yeah.
Long-term thinking, gang.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's really what kids are about, is long-term thinking. And
Yeah.
yeah. And if there's any young women out there, think about it, because it's one of the great joys of life. And I missed out, and I really regret it.
Yeah. I mean, and I did too. And that's a lot of women, both your generation and mine. And there's a lot of different factors for it. I mean, and I mean, and if you don't make a priority of it, what if one day you change your mind and you're trying to, and then you discover, oh,
Mm,
you have infertility issues, or there's
yeah.
something else going on. I mean, sometimes this is one of those things where I feel like you almost do need to leap before you look, because
Mm,
I think people
yes.
overthink it, and they're like,
Yeah.
I cannot envision the next 20 years inside of my head, therefore I better not do it at all. Like, you figure out
Hmm.
the next 20 years as you go along. At least that's what my friends who have children tell me.
That my friends with kids tell me the same thing, and no one's ever prepared. That's just a reality. You can't prepare for a complete stranger coming into your life because you don't know what you're getting,
Yeah.
and they're a complete
No, and
stranger. You can't prepare
I
for
mean,
that. All you can do is say
I
hello.
mean, and who knows how much is really nature? How much of that personality exists and is pretty well set by the time they pop out of the womb. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't know. I mean, there's always going to be only so much you can influence. Those who do have children, I do recommend looking up your kids' natal birth charts.
Mm,
As you study
that's
that, it will give you some
helpful.
insights and it might help you decide different techniques, especially when they're having their little spazzy moments, which they inevitably do. At least if you understand why, you might be able to kind of redirect the energy at least a little bit. But I think also, because the woman's role in the home has been demonized, not just demonized, delegitimized,
Mm,
just this hideous thing. I think it has also cut us off from a major source of our power. And women talk about power all the time. We
mhm.
are power hungry maniacs. When we do embrace that role of the home, we want to make sure that we are the top dog. We are in charge of what's going on in that household. I'm, as if my husband and I ever get out to our own farm, I told him I'm really looking forward to that because so many things that are chores that we share in together I will be taking over completely. I will have absolute power and he will be at my mercy. And that makes all of my inner tyrant instincts very, very happy. And I think it's good for us to acknowledge this about ourselves because, the reason why we crave power so much is because we are wanting to do something. And you cannot
Yes.
do anything if you do not have power. And
Yes.
ultimately, what our
Yes.
instinct to do
Absolutely.
is
Yes.
to create our own world. And that's what you're doing with your household. You are creating
Yeah.
your world in a way
Yeah.
that you'll never do with a job. And I'm not
Yes.
saying that everyone can give up their job, but I'm just saying maybe that's not the center of your existence. Maybe
Mhm.
like, well, it's
And maybe
like
it shouldn't be.
it'll yeah, it'll never love me back.
Yeah.
And maybe this is because I'm a Leo and being loved back is really important to me. But I don't really want to invest beyond a certain point for something that is never going to return the favor. That
Mhm.
does not make sense to me to do. Whereas
Mm.
when you properly invest in a marriage, and you do have to choose properly, if you invest in at least the possibility of having children, that increases the odds of being loved back and to have being
Mhm.
able to have walking, talking reminders of how you have created your universe. You want to talk about a power trip? I'm pretty sure that's about as good as it gets.
I get to say I love that. Um, there's a one of the things I wrote in the storytellers, the last story, Pandora, is which you read. Um,
Hmm.
that
Loved, by the way.
thank you. Um, that Hera says, if you are depressed or you're feeling overwhelmed, go make something. You know,
Hmm.
make some food, make some fabric, make some art, make a child, make something.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
that it gives you some focus. It gives you hope. To create gives you hope. Because
Oh,
why
and
do
it
it?
trans
It
and
what
and it
moves
transmutes the energy. I mean, you
yes,
take all
yes.
that energy from your anxiety and you've turned it into something that
Mhm,
is so much better. I think there's a lot we can do to really take hold of our own energy a lot more. And this is another thing where I feel like it's my side of the pagan tribe that really needs to be stepping up to the plate to show people how this
mhm,
can be done, even if you're not, working with the same well of magical talent, about how you can take your emotions and change them around. It does
mhm.
require self-discipline, and I'll be honest, not every day are we mature enough or rational enough to do so. That's another issue that we need to work on as a society and as pagan people is going into a greater state of maturity because maturity has not been admired for several generations,
Mm,
and that's very sad because as someone who's I'm in my 40s and I would like to have the full measure and dignity and respect of a crone once I transition into that. And that's not going to happen unless we have a change of some cultural attitudes. So, from a purely selfish point of view, I think we do need to be a lot more embracing of every stage of life. And this is one way that women can also embrace that change of stage of life, going from the maiden to the woman of the household, to the mother, then to the grandmother, to the crone. You always have a place and a purpose. And you and I, we always do too, because we have our spiritual work. But again, it's very community oriented. It's all
Mhm.
for using the benefit of our experience and even saying, look at our mistakes, look at the things we regret. You don't have to do that. It's better if you don't. And actually putting ourselves out there and allowing ourselves that vulnerability to hopefully making an impact upon someone who's at a stage in their life where they do have an opportunity to make a different choice, where they can make the investments. And when, most of all, they're getting someone say, this is okay. It is good for you to do this. You have
Mm.
not let the side down if you do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, any other thoughts you want to add before we kind of wrap this thing up?
I think we're there.
I
I think
think
I'm
we're
there.
there. I
Okay.
think we talked a lot of things out today.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you accepted my invitation to come on and talk about all this. I have been nagging everyone on my channel all day long, get every daily forecast video, and in the Pagan Tales series about the importance of hearth keeping and
Mhm.
deities and everything else with that. So I am very glad that they got an opportunity to be nagged by someone other than me today. Thank you, especially to Elizabeth Russell, who's been with us in the comments and periodically giving us atta girls. That is very much appreciated. And if you are watching this after the live stream, please, not don't just hit that like button or dislike button, whichever floats your boat. But leave us a comment. Let us know where your own thoughts take you. Share your own experiences with this. Maybe get into a conversation with someone else in the comments section, because the more we compare notes, I think the better off we are. And I think also this is a way of us affirming each other's instincts, affirming our observations, and offering each other some mutual support for what has been a very confusing and difficult time.
Mm.
Don't be bashful, I guess. But Selena, let everyone know where they can find you.
I have a pagan blog at on Substack, and I believe it's 21st Century Pagan. So if you do a search
Mhm.
for that, and I'm the only one there that's going to be called that, so you're good. And I'm on Amazon, so you can look me up as an author on Amazon. You probably have to type in the name exactly right, like it says on the screen right there, because if you misspell it, you're not getting anywhere. So you might want to start with 21st Century Pagan. That's easier.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone. We will see you all on another occasion. Bye, audience.